They were supposed to bury the dead, not create them. In the silent fog of early October 1823, a young boy named Thomas Fisher stared through the cracked window of his attic bedroom in rural Belford Hollow, Pennsylvania. He watched a lantern bobbing in the woods behind his neighbor's funeral home, long after the town had gone to sleep. What he saw next was burned into his mind forever. Two men digging, not burying, and something wrapped in cloth, moving slightly, before it disappeared beneath the dirt. The next morning, that same boy delivered milk to the back porch of the Wainwright funeral home and was handed 2 coins by a smiling man whose hands were still covered in soil. 17 people vanished in this town between August and November. No official investigations, no bodies recovered. Only one thing linked them all. Every family had recently been in contact with the Wainwrights, the family who ran the only mortuary for 40 miles. The very people entrusted with death had become something else. But you won't find this in textbooks. Because what lies buried beneath the ground in Belford Hollow is not just bone and coffin. It's something older, a system of control that uses death as currency. And the Wainwright family were not simply undertakers. They were gatekeepers to something far darker. A lineage of silence, ritual, and power disguised as small-town civility. You see, in 1823, Pennsylvania was not just a landscape of farms and churches. It was a laboratory for America's emerging moral code. A code easily manipulated by the right kind of grief. And grief is the perfect disguise. Over the next hour, you're going to descend into the true story of how one family used compassion as a mask and a shovel as their signature. This is not a tale of madness. It's a tale of calculation, of what happens when a family learns that the dead cannot speak, and those who do are buried right beside them. Let this be your first warning. The Wainwrights did not go missing. They were protected. Hidden, preserved, because even the authorities knew some secrets are safer 6 feet under. You've heard the old saying, the dead tell no tales, but that's a lie. In Belford Hollow, they screamed in silence from under the floorboards. The Wainwright family wasn't new to Pennsylvania. They had arrived in 1798 from a lesser-known village in southern England, a region whispered about for its death studies, unofficial rituals practiced by men who claimed to understand the science of soul release. That word alone, science, would later be used to justify things that cannot be described without vomiting. By 1823, Patriarch Abraham Wainwright had built more than just a funeral home. He had constructed a system, one that reached into the pockets of the clergy, local officials, and landowners. Because when you control how the dead are buried, you control how the living remember. Abraham was no ordinary mortician. He referred to himself as a separator, not just of body and soul, but of secrets from the surface. He believed every corpse held a vibration, an imprint of whatever crime or curse had taken it, and he made it his duty to extract that imprint and store it, not in books, not in words, but in flesh. This is where it gets darker. His 3 sons, Elias, Jeremiah, and Seth, had been trained since childhood to assist in retention rituals. These weren't funeral rites. They were dissections done in total silence, with iron instruments, in a stone chamber beneath the barn, lit by oil lamps and marked by chalk sigils none of the local masons recognized. The Wainwrights operated under the guise of kindness. Elias wrote condolences to grieving families. Jeremiah delivered fresh loaves of bread to the recently widowed. Seth dug the graves, but never filled them the way people expected. When the town doctor, Richard Morley, raised questions about the rising number of sudden dropsy deaths, his horse was found slaughtered in the creek. A week later, he left town. And here's where it spirals. One widow, Clara Hart, claimed she saw her late husband walking the Wainwright property a week after his burial. She was laughed at, then institutionalized in nearby Reading. The last thing she said before they took her away? He wasn't dead. He was drugged. And the gravedigger smiled when I screamed. There's something you need to understand about 1823. When someone disappeared, people assumed the wilderness took them. Wolves, thieves, snowstorms. That's what made the Wainwrights so untouchable. They gave the townsfolk a comfortable lie to cling to, while burying the truth in plain sight. Every town needs a family people can trust. The Wainwrights became that family. Their funeral home didn't just serve the grieving, it dominated the rhythm of death in the valley. Every prayer, every coffin, every whispered goodbye flowed through their hands. And no one asked why they insisted on closed caskets. They called it respect for the departed. But it was about control. Because once the body went into the Wainwrights' care, it stopped being yours. Some were drained, others were injected, some were locked in wooden boxes before their heart even stopped beating. But here's the terrifying part. Some didn't die in the house. They died beneath it. A trapdoor behind the embalming table led to a chamber with iron rings drilled into the stone walls. The sheriff who discovered it in 1831 didn't file a report. He disappeared 2 weeks later. His widow moved to Ohio and burned every photo she owned of Belford Hollow. The local pastor, Reverend Elijah Brooks, knew more than he said. He called the Wainwright boys God-fearing men from the pulpit. But in private, he told his sister something else. They don't bury sinners, they harvest them. That letter was found stuffed behind a church hymnal during renovations in 1887. The ink was blurred with what looked like blood. The last line read, "They asked me to bless their pit." I said no. That night I woke up to find ashes in my mouth. And here's what no one wants to admit. The disappearances weren't random. They were selected. Childless women, drifters, aging bachelors with land deeds, anyone whose absence would raise questions, or better yet, eliminate questions others were asking. 17 names. And the deeper you look, the more it feels like 17 warnings. But you weren't supposed to look, were you? You're looking now, which means you're already inside the story. And once you're inside the Wainwrights' world, the doors don't open outward. They only close behind you. Let's strip away the illusion. The Wainwright family didn't serve the dead. They served something else. Something older than scripture, more methodical than madness, and buried deeper than any grave they ever dug. It started with Abraham's obsession. Preservation of memory, he called it. But it wasn't memory he was keeping. It was energy. In a dusty journal found in the rafters of the funeral home's carriage loft, now locked away in a private archive, one entry stood out. Not all spirits leave the body willingly. Some remain if handled correctly. The trick is to catch them in the moment before departure. Then bind. Bind. That word would echo through later pages, etched repeatedly like a ritual chant. Bind the soul. Bind the silence. Bind the debt. It wasn't metaphor. The Wainwrights believed they could trap human essence, not to set it free, but to use it. The 17 who vanished? Not buried, not burned, bound. Each chosen with surgical precision, each death spaced precisely 7.5 days apart. Not random, ritual. And in the center of it all was Seth. He wasn't just the gravedigger. He was the interpreter. Locals described him as quiet, with cold eyes and a habit of standing barefoot in the cemetery at night. Children were warned not to speak to him, but one boy did. Jacob Tiller, age 9. He wandered too close while playing with a tin soldier. Came home pale and shaking. All he said was, "The gravedigger asked me what color my shadow was." That boy stopped speaking entirely by winter. Now, here's what's truly chilling. A hidden chamber beneath the Wainwright barn was discovered in 1876. Inside were jars, hundreds of them, each with a tag. each marked with a name, each filled with a swirling, honey-thick liquid that glowed faintly in the dark. And those names? They matched the town's 1823 death records, except for one thing. Those names were "Is never buried." No gravestone, no obituary, just sealed vessels, waiting. You still think this is just murder? Then you haven't been paying attention. The Wainwrights weren't hiding bodies. They were collecting souls. The deeper you go into the Wainwright legacy, the more you begin to realize this wasn't just a family. It was a doctrine, a closed system of belief hidden behind black veils and polished coffins. And in 1823, that system entered its most dangerous phase, the harvest season. Autumn in Belford Hollow was always cold, but that year, something unnatural crept in. The air smelled of copper. Dogs refused to cross the churchyard. People whispered about a sound, low and constant, that came from beneath the earth near the Wainwright property, like breathing, like something waiting. The first of the missing was Josiah Crane, a mail courier who made weekly deliveries through the hollow. Never married, no children. All that remained was his hat, placed neatly on the steps of the funeral home. Next was Mildred Bell, a deaf widow who lived in a farmhouse up the slope. They said she'd gone senile and wandered off, but the lamp in her window stayed lit for 3 days after she vanished. No one claimed to light it. Then came Isaac Monroe, a drifter, a drunk, the kind of man no one asked about when he stopped showing up at the tavern. But a week later, a child found his wedding ring tied around a crow's neck with a red ribbon. Each disappearance seemed isolated, explainable, but only to those who wanted explanations. Not everyone did. Marjorie Bly, a schoolteacher with a sharp tongue and sharper mind, kept notes. She wasn't afraid of the Wainwrights, not at first. She had lost her brother the previous year and remembered something strange. The casket had felt empty. When she leaned in for one final goodbye, she heard a knock. She told the sheriff. The next week, she was found in her classroom, still seated at her desk, eyes wide, mouth open, no signs of violence, but her hands were missing. Her death was ruled a nervous seizure. The next day, the Wainwright boys donated money for new desks in her memory. You think this was about hiding bodies? No. This was about feeding something precise, something ancient. And every 7.5 days, it opened its mouth. And the Wainwrights knew exactly how to keep it full. It was called the dimming. Not officially, not in town records, but that's what the older farmers whispered that year, 1823. They said the sky over Belford Hollow dimmed 2 shades darker than the rest of the county, that the sun didn't hit the Wainwright land the same way it hit the church steeple or the old tannery hill. The light bent differently, or refused to land at all, and no one could explain why the graveyard grass turned black. It wasn't dead, just wrong, as if it no longer belonged to the world of seasons and weather, but something colder, something governed by a different sun. That fall, 17 funerals were held, but only 8 of them had bodies. The rest were symbolic, said Abraham Wainwright, a courtesy for closure. But even the most trusting townsfolk felt the lie. When the bells rang from St. Caleb's, they rang hollow. And more than once, mourners noticed the strange smell in the chapel air, like ash and vinegar. And then there were the murmurs. It started in the eaves of the Wainwright house, a faint whispering, unintelligible like words spoken backward. The stable boy, Peter Ames, said he heard them most at dusk, claimed they called him by name, not with sound, but inside his chest. He hung himself in the rafters 3 weeks later. Left a note that said, "Tell the gravedigger I won't open my mouth again." The town preacher tried to intervene. Reverend Brooks demanded an exhumation. He wanted to open the most recent casket, a child's, buried just 2 days prior. The Wainwrights objected, then relented. But when the lid opened, it didn't hold a body. It held salt. 3 full sacks of it, soaked through with what looked like blood water. Reverend Brooks fell ill that same night, fevered, delirious, raving about eyes in the floorboards, mouths in the dirt. He died before morning, his tongue bitten clean through the Wainwrights. What family paid for his burial? But his plot was never found. And the town, what did it do? Nothing. Because by then, Belford Hollow had entered the phase that always follows revelation. Not panic, not rage, but the most dangerous emotion of all, compliance. Silence is never accidental in a town like Belford Hollow. By the 7th disappearance, people weren't just afraid, they were complicit, averting their eyes, locking their doors, pretending not to see the Wainwright cart roll by just before dusk, one wooden box heavier than it should have been. They knew what that box meant, and they let it happen. The Wainwrights no longer needed to ask permission for the dead. They came with quiet shoes and pale gloves. They walked straight into homes where grief had already made its home, homes where a child had just stopped breathing or an elder had passed in their sleep. They offered no prayers, no condolences, just a nod, as if fulfilling a contract already signed. And sometimes, there hadn't even been a death. One account, unconfirmed but repeated often, tells of a mother who buried a still warm blanket. Her daughter, Alice, had vanished in the night. No signs of struggle, just her bonnet left on the windowsill and muddy footprints leading into the woods behind the Wainwright property. Not out. The mother insisted she heard giggling near the well 2 nights later, said it wasn't Alice's voice, but it knew her name. The sheriff offered a quiet explanation. Grief-induced hallucination. But why then was that same well boarded shut the next morning? And why did Seth Wainwright spend 3 hours alone beside it, singing? He wasn't known to speak much, but on those rare occasions, his words were riddles, phrases that made no sense but hung in the air like echoes of something older. Soil remembers the taste of a soul. We plant the silence, harvest the scream. You can't bury a shadow, you can only feed it. Was he mad? Or was he speaking plainly in a language no one else wanted to understand? Because what everyone feared, deep down, was that the Wainwrights weren't breaking rules. They were following instructions. And the town was following them too. Not because they believed, but because belief was no longer required. Only obedience. And Belford Hollow obeyed. There was an old saying in Belford Hollow, "The Wainwrights don't bury the dead, they just send them home." At first, it sounded poetic, a kind sentiment about the afterlife. But by winter of 1823, that phrase took on a different tone, less comforting, more instructional. And the more people repeated it, the more it sounded like a warning disguised as wisdom. That's when the ledger was found. A young apprentice at the town's printing press, Elijah Corms, stumbled across a leather-bound journal beneath the floorboards. It wasn't dusty. It was oiled, recently handled. Inside were 17 names. Not of the dead, of the unaccounted, people who had vanished between July and November of that year. Each name written with surgical precision. Next to every entry, a date, a time, and a symbol. Not in English, not in Latin, something older. One symbol repeated. It resembled an open mouth. Elijah showed the book to the local magistrate who promised a full investigation. 2 nights later, Elijah's body was found in the creek behind St. Caleb's. Tongue cut out, fingers broken backward, pages from the journal stuffed in his mouth. The journal itself? Gone. The magistrate claimed Elijah had suffered a crisis of the mind and buried the incident without inquiry. But something changed in town after that. People started walking faster past the funeral home. The bell in the chapel stopped ringing. Doors were barred, curtains closed before sunset. And still, people disappeared. One every 7.5 days. Like clockwork. A pattern not of chaos, but ritual. That's when the midwife, Eleanor Bristow, whispered the word no one else dared say aloud. Sacrifice. She'd delivered a child weeks earlier, healthy, loud, full of breath. The next day, the family claimed the baby had died. But Eleanor remembered the father's face, pale, stiff, eyes refusing to meet hers. And when she tried, and to check the body, there was no burial, just a note pinned to her door the next morning. You've seen enough. Close your eyes or we'll do it for you. Signed, Dao, no first name, just an initial, like a brand. And that was the moment it became clear. This was no longer a funeral home. It was a gateway. And the Wainwrights were its keepers. Most funeral homes are built to honor the dead. The Wainwright home was built to contain them. You could feel it, even just standing near the threshold. The air was wrong, heavy, like something had been compressed beneath it for years, pushing back, refusing to stay buried. Inside, the walls were lined with thick oak, stained darker than mahogany. But the stain wasn't wood oil. It smelled metallic. The floorboards creaked too often, even when no one moved. Visitors said they felt watched in every room, especially in the embalming cellar. That room was never open to the public. But Joseph Bell, a carpenter sent to replace a collapsed beam in late January 1824, was one of the few outsiders allowed in. He entered at 8:00 a.m. He staggered out just before noon, pale, trembling, and missing 2 fingernails. He refused to speak for weeks. When he finally did, he said only 3 words. The pipes breathe. He died 2 months later. Pneumonia, they claimed, but his body decomposed in just 4 days, too fast for the cold weather. His widow said he'd been whispering in his sleep before he died, repeating the same phrase over and over. It's not buried. It's waiting. By now, the Wainwright boys, Seth and Elias, had taken full control of the home. Their father, Obadiah, had fallen ill. Neighbors saw him only once, seated in a rocking chair facing the cellar door. He looked like a man already dead, pale as parchment, lips moving, but no sound. Some said he'd been praying. Others said he was listening. And then there was the matter of the back room, never marked, never unlocked. But once, a boy named Jeremiah caught sight through the keyhole. He described a stone altar, carvings, deep grooves in the walls like claw marks, and in the center, a chair made of bone. The next morning, the boy had no memory of what he'd seen. He didn't even remember sneaking near the house. But from that day on, he refused to sit anywhere for the rest of his life. The Wainwrights never denied the rumors. They didn't have to, because by now, denial wouldn't save you, only distance. And even then, not always. On February 3rd, 1824, the town's only constable, Isaac Marlin, filed a sealed affidavit with the regional court in Harrisburg. He'd seen enough: the disappearances, the whispers, the strange nocturnal deliveries to the Wainwright home, and the sounds. He described the sounds as wet moaning beneath wood, like something trying to cry through dirt and teeth. But Isaac never made it to Harrisburg. 2 miles outside town, his horse was found riderless, reins tangled in barbed brush. His satchel was still tied to the saddle, court documents intact. But the affidavit itself, ripped cleanly from its sheath. Locals said a search party found Isaac's boot, just one, sticking straight out of a fresh grave behind the Wainwright chapel. But when they dug, they found nothing underneath, just more dirt. They never found the rest of him. The town understood. This wasn't a place you accused. It was a place you endured. Silent suffering became tradition. Births, deaths, disappearances, all met with numb prayer. People hoped that by keeping their heads down, they'd stay invisible. But silence doesn't keep you safe from what already sees you, especially if it's already counted you. A man named Aldous Green tried to run. He'd seen Seth Wainwright under the full moon, dragging something, or someone, wrapped in linen across the cemetery. He told his wife they had to leave. They packed that night. But by morning, the door was open, the stove was cold, and both Aldous and his wife were gone. The only thing left behind was a note smeared in what looked like ash and salt. "We are measured in weight, not worth." Signed again, you. The handwriting was identical to the one left for Eleanor Bristow. That week, a storm swept through the hollow. Not rain, not snow, just thick black wind that carried the scent of soil and old iron. It howled like a dirge, and when it passed, Eventine white flowers were found outside the Wainwright home, laid in a perfect ring, the same number of names in the vanished ledger. And inside the house, the bell rang once. No wind, no hands, just one deep toll, as if announcing something. Not an ending, a beginning. Most families inherit land, debt, or heirlooms. The Wainwright sons inherited a right. By early spring of 1824, Obadiah Wainwright had vanished from public view entirely. Some said he'd died. Others whispered he'd been taken into the walls. But there was no funeral, no burial, no mourning, just a new, unsettling rhythm inside the home. Seth began walking the perimeter of their property every morning, barefoot, no coat, even when the frost was thick and the trees bare. He moved like he was tracing a shape no one else could see. Elias didn't leave the cellar for days at a time. They said strange colored smoke rose from the chimney at night, green, then blue, then none at all. One farmer, passing by during a thunderstorm, swore he saw lightning stop mid-air as it neared the house. Not redirect. Stop. And still, the town said nothing. But not everyone was silent. A woman named Hester Aldwin, the last living midwife in Belford Hollow, spoke out. She'd delivered over 90 children in her lifetime, and buried nearly half of them under mysterious circumstances. She claimed the Wainwrights had struck a pact with something older than Scripture, something that dwelled below their foundation. She called it the mouth beneath. Her accusation: the Wainwrights didn't bury the dead, they fed them. Her testimony was recorded in a private journal, now missing, but one excerpt was reportedly copied by a traveling preacher before the journal vanished. It reads, "The bones do not rest, they are processed, their marrow poured like oil, their eyes harvested for remembrance, their tongues stored for the next to speak in blood." That same night, Hester's home caught fire. She was never seen again. All that remained were her shoes, neatly placed beside the unburnt hearth. The town interpreted it not as a warning, but as a lesson. That spring, the Wainwrights began receiving visitors from out of town, men dressed in black, women who never blinked. They entered the house without knocking, and left with nothing in their hands, but a smile that didn't reach their eyes. These weren't mourners. They were witnesses. To what exactly, no one knew. But the graves behind the house had grown deeper, and the air heavier, like the earth was preparing for something, and we were merely guests. It was late April when the Hollow's children began to speak in sleep. At first, parents mistook it for fever dreams, but soon the murmurs shared the same phrases, words the children had never been taught. Latin-sounding syllables, reversed scripture, numbers whispered backward, and names. Names of the missing. Names no child should have known. They spoke of tunnels beneath the fields, of hands that reached upward, of teeth buried in rows like crops. One boy, Thomas Reddick, screamed every time the church bell rang. He said it wasn't calling to heaven, it was calling from below. When his parents tried to calm him, he began convulsing and spat mud. Real, wet mud. By May, 5 families had packed up and fled Belford Hollow in silence. They didn't even sell their land. They left livestock, furniture, photographs behind, as if whatever was coming couldn't be outrun, only abandoned. Still, the Wainwright funeral home carried on. No interruption, no delay, no grief, only routine. Each burial followed the same chilling process. No embalming, no family allowed past the gate, no gravestone placed for 7 days. And most chilling of all, not a single bird ever flew over the Wainwright cemetery. It was as if even nature itself refused to witness. One night, a man named Edgar Dorn broke into the Wainwright plot. He was looking for his brother, who had vanished into their ledger 2 weeks prior. He never found a headstone, but he did find something else. A mirror, half buried in the dirt, facing downward. When he turned it over, he saw his brother's face staring up, mouth open, eyes blinking. And then, it smiled. Edgar ran, blind with terror. The next morning, he was found hanging in his barn. Carved into the beam above him were 5 words, etched with something dull and splintered. Do not disturb the process. Below it, a small square of linen, numbered 18. There were only 17 people officially missing. Now, there was an 18th, and still, the Wainwright house remained silent, except for the bell, which now rang twice a night, always at the same hour, 3:33 a.m., the hour of inversion, the hour the living are most like the dead. There was one man in Belford Hollow who had no use for superstition, Judge Bartholomew Crane. Crane was a rationalist, a scholar, the kind of man who read law books by candlelight and dismissed folk fears as the product of idle minds and empty stomachs. But when his daughter Lydia disappeared walking home from chapel, Crane's reason began to rot. He confronted the Wainwrights directly, stormed the funeral home with pistol in hand, demanding to see every casket, every grave. Seth simply stared at him. Elias opened the cellar door, and what Crane saw, no one knows. Because when he emerged 2 hours later, he wasn't a man anymore. He was hollow. He walked with a limp he didn't have before. He blinked less. He drank more. And he never, ever mentioned Lydia again. At night, locals said they saw him standing in his garden, just standing, with soil up to his ankles, eyes open, mouth slightly parted, as if listening for something beneath. Then came the incident with Reverend Mott. The church had finally planned to excommunicate the Wainwrights, declare them unholy, revoke burial rites, and begin a public investigation into the funeral home's practices. But the night before the announcement, the church bell fell from its tower. No wind, no storm, just a single deafening crack, and then silence. Inside, the wreckage was Reverend Mott's body. Face down, hands bound, nails missing, buried in his own vestments, stitched shut at the lips with human hair. The message was clear. The Wainwrights didn't need permission. They had patience. And patience, they believed, always fed the deepest roots. Then, the final turn. One morning, the Wainwright gates opened to the public. A sign was posted, "Free burials, no cost, no delay, all are welcome." That week, 3 poor families volunteered their recently deceased. The offer was too tempting. Especially ally in a town strangled by debt and dread. They never saw the bodies again. But one widow, Mabel Skinner, returned to the funeral grounds weeks later. She claimed she felt her boy calling from the ground. She brought a shovel. What she uncovered wasn't her son. It was a tunnel, bricked over, stamped in Latin, and below it, scratched into the clay, 17 down, 1 to go. The authorities never dug further. They told her it was imagination. She knew better. She had buried her husband years earlier, and the soil had never been warm until now. After the tunnel was found, something in Belford Hollow shifted. The dogs stopped barking at night. The children stopped speaking in their sleep. Even the sky seemed darker, like the stars had pulled farther away. But most disturbing of all, the ground began to hum. Not loud, not constant, just a low, pulsing vibration. Beneath floorboards, through bedposts, under bare feet at dusk, as if something alive was moving through the roots of the earth, tracing veins through forgotten bones. Local carpenters blamed it on sinkholes. Farmers said it was groundwater. But the sound didn't match anything natural. It didn't echo. It didn't fade. It circled, like a predator. One night, a schoolteacher named Miss Eliza Rowe couldn't take it anymore. She gathered 5 of her oldest students, lit lanterns, and went to the cemetery herself. She never returned. 3 days later, one of the students, Jonah Tiller, came back alone, soaked in mud, barefoot, clutching a dead bird in each hand. He didn't speak a word for 2 years. When he finally did, he simply said, "They showed her how it's done. The sewing, the turning." Jonah's mother later found a small book under his floorboard. It wasn't his. Inside were burial diagrams, not of where bodies went, but how they were arranged. Each skeleton placed in a perfect spiral, 17 total, all faceless. And, at the spiral's center, a black shape. No name, no dimensions. Just one word written beneath it: host. People began leaving Belford Hollow in droves after that. By winter, only 14 families remained. The rest abandoned their homes, doors open, windows shattered, food left rotting on tables. But the Wainwright house stayed bright, candles always lit, curtains never moved, and the bell, now rusted and buried in weeds, still rang without rope, always at 3:33 a.m. Then came the thaws of early March. Graves began to sink. Coffins, once buried deep, now protruded slightly through the earth, like they were rising or being pushed. One morning, a farmhand spotted Seth Wainwright in the woods, holding a lantern to the roots of an overturned tree. He wasn't digging. He was listening. And when he turned to face the farmhand, his mouth opened, and soil poured out. Not fell, poured, like a voice speaking through dirt. Sheriff Amos Cutter had ignored the whispers for too long. He'd dismissed the 13 missing townsfolk as runaways, claimed Lydia Crane drowned, said Reverend Mott's death was accidental, maybe even self-inflicted. But when a child's tooth surfaced in the church well, embedded in a clump of funeral clay, Cutter could no longer pretend. He gathered 6 men, all armed, all sworn to secrecy. At midnight, they marched to the Wainwright funeral home. They never returned. The next morning, only Cutter's hat was found, placed neatly atop the chapel's altar, filled with soil and a single crow's feather stabbed through the crown. A letter arrived at the town clerk's office later that week. It was unsigned, written in a trembling, unnatural hand. The ink was black and sticky, more like pitch than ink. It read, "We tend not only to the dead, but to the awaiting. 17 roots feed the tree. 1 root sings, 1 remains uncut. Stop digging." Then, nothing. No more disappearances. No more funerals. No sound from the Wainwright home. For 7 months, silence held the town in a noose. Until little Clara Groves wandered into the woods to collect firewood and stumbled into a clearing that hadn't existed before. In its center stood a sculpture made entirely of bone. Not arranged, not stacked, grown. 17 limbs, interwoven, reaching up like they were trying to crawl back into the sky. Clara said it was singing, said the song came from inside her own head, said it sounded like her mother's voice, even though her mother had died giving birth to her. The child drew it, perfectly, precisely, over and over, each drawing different in detail but always the same number of limbs. 17. By spring, an eerie peace had settled on Belford Hollow, but underneath the silence, something was listening. Men reported their shovels going missing. Barns smelled of embalming fluid. And one woman, Ruth Mallory, found her own name carved into the bark of a tree she'd never seen before. Her name, and a date that hadn't arrived yet. The townsfolk no longer spoke of the Wainwrights, but the ground hadn't forgotten them, and neither had what lived beneath it. The Belford Hollow census for 1823 recorded a total of 312 residents. By fall of 1824, that number had dropped to 263. No formal deaths, no recorded migrations, no witnesses, just names, slowly vanishing from memory. Children forgot their siblings. Wives couldn't remember their husbands' faces. Tombstones began to bear initials, not names. When pressed, the town clerk confessed something chilling. Some of these names I never wrote. They were already here when I opened the ledger. He swore entire pages had been filled by unseen hands, the ink fresh, the handwriting alien. And in the margins, a small symbol began to appear over and over again, an inverted hourglass, dripping not sand, but ash. It appeared on windows, on fences, on the collars of newborns. One preacher, terrified by what he called a slow vanishing, began giving sermons in silence, standing for 40 minutes at the pulpit without speaking, sweating profusely, his eyes never blinking, until one Sunday, his tongue simply turned black and fell out mid-sermon. No blood, no scream, just a wet, final thud on the chapel floor. After that, families began sewing crosses inside their clothes, burying knives in door frames, speaking in hushed codes, as if something unseen was listening for names, or worse, permission. Then came the wind. It blew only from the east, cold, heavy, like breath from a stone mouth. With it came the smell, not of rot or sulfur, but wedding oil. A thick, sweet scent used by the Wainwrights to prepare the dead for burial. But this smell wasn't coming from the funeral home. It came from beneath the schoolhouse. The children grew restless again. Some began drawing that same spiral, 17 figures curled inward, a black center labeled simply air. One girl claimed her dead grandfather visited her at night, not to comfort her, but to warn her. He whispered, "Tell them not to open it. Not this time. It's not a root. It's a jaw." By winter, the ground itself had changed. Moss refused to grow. Rivers curved slightly around the Wainwright property, like nature itself recoiled. And every night, every single night, the church bell, long rusted shut, began to tremble. Not ring, just tremble, as if waiting for a hand that hadn't touched it yet. Winter bit deep that year, sharper than any before. Snow piled high against the windows of Belford Hollow, yet inside the homes, the fires burned colder, dimmer, as if the heat itself had grown afraid. And beneath it all, beneath every chimney, cellar, and floorboard, a low vibration began. Not a sound, a pressure, like something massive, breathing from under the town. At first, it was dismissed as frozen ground shifting. But then, people started waking up with soil under their fingernails. Even the children. They hadn't sleepwalked. They hadn't left their homes. Yet they woke with muddy footprints at their bedsides and dirt caked behind their ears. Doctors were called from Philadelphia. They never arrived. The townspeople sent letters, not to the authorities but to other towns, begging for priests, exorcists, even gravediggers. Only one replied. A blind man named Father Elijah Kettner. He arrived on foot, alone. His first words were not hello or where is the church. They were, the mouth has opened. The wrong bone was moved. This town is already inside it. Kettner refused to sleep indoors. He pitched a tent on the outskirts of town and prayed in circles drawn from crushed bone. He carried no cross, only a rusted iron key, which he claimed doesn't open, only seals. And every night he faced east, whispering to a grave that had no headstone, no name, no visible body beneath it. Then, 3 nights in, the earth shook, just once, like a jolt, a warning. The next morning, all 17 graves of the Wainwright family stood empty. No soil displaced, no footprints, just open caskets, their linings torn, their silk blackened, curled inward like scorched petals. Each coffin had something etched into its base. One root was never severed. Kettner gathered the townsfolk in the chapel that evening. Candles flickered. Wind howled. Ed, though the windows were shut. He asked them, "Who last touched the soil?" No one answered. So he asked again, softer this time, "Who whispered into it?" A little boy in the front row began to cry. He pointed at the floor beneath the altar. "There's something breathing under us." Then the bell tower began to sway, and not from the wind. It was moving, like a metronome. Left, right, keeping time for something about to rise. They found Father Kettner's tent torn apart the next morning, not by animal or man, but inward, as if something had pulled the fabric toward a central point and then vanished. His iron key lay in the center, still warm, still humming. And beside it, written in frost along the ground, 3 perfect words: "You opened it." Inside the town, things began to unravel fast. One by one, residents stopped answering their doors. Shadows flickered through windows, but no footsteps followed. Children sang hymns in reverse. Dogs refused to bark. And then, the doors began to lock themselves from the outside. Homes sealed like tombs. Whole families found encased in their beds. Not dead, not asleep, but vanished. No screams, no struggle. Just the imprint of where someone once was, now sunken into the sheets like they'd been absorbed. By then, only 32 townsfolk remained. They gathered once more at the chapel, the one place untouched by the cold breath of whatever had seeped into the earth. Inside, they formed a circle. No one spoke. No one dared. Then, from the back of the room, the altar shifted. Not subtly. It slid, dragged back 6 inches by nothing visible, revealing beneath it a square trapdoor made of stone. None had ever seen it. Not even the pastor. It bore a single engraving, the inverted hourglass. And beside it, carved in meticulous bone-deep letters, "They are not beneath. You are above." A silence fell like a curse. No one dared move. Until the youngest child present, a mute girl of 7, walked forward and pressed her hand against the symbol. The stone glowed red, just once, and the trapdoor opened on its own. What lay beneath wasn't stairs. It was a tunnel, perfectly round, dug with precision, lined in soft black velvet and slick with what looked like embalming oil. A sound echoed from within. Not wind, not whisper, a lullaby. Something ancient, foreign, yet familiar. The girl began to descend without hesitation. When someone tried to pull her back, her body stiffened, not in fear, but defiance. She whispered her only words. "They're waiting for their blood." Then she was gone, and the trapdoor closed on its own. The chapel went silent. No creak from the pews, no breath, no sobs. Just that lingering warmth on the stone trapdoor where the child had vanished, like her skin had branded it. For nearly an hour, no one spoke. Then, without warning, every candle in the room went out at once. Not from wind. They were snuffed by unseen fingers, deliberate and slow. Panic didn't come with screaming. It came with whispers. 32 voices turning on one another. Accusations, confessions, cries of, "I saw them digging again. You fed the ground when you thought we weren't looking." The old pastor collapsed, clutching his chest, eyes wide, not from pain, but from recognition. He gasped, "I buried them once, but they never stopped watching me." And then he died. No one moved to help. They all stared at the trapdoor, because something had begun knocking. Once, twice, a third time. Then the knocking turned to scraping. A dragging noise, not rising but circling, from just beneath the floor. The chapel shuddered. Pews cracked. The crucifix on the far wall turned upside down on its own. Not fallen. Turned. Outside, the sky had blackened, though it was barely past noon. Snow fell upward, swirling into a funnel above the chapel roof. And then, a single bell rang. But it wasn't the chapel bell. It was a smaller one, rusted, handheld, from a funeral cart, long since rotted away. The sound echoed through the walls like a memory returned. And behind it, a voice. It came from beneath the trapdoor. Clear, gentle, measured. 17 were taken, but 17 were not born. The others must be carved into the soil. The floorboards began to sweat. Each knot in the wood turned black, pulsing. The walls bled something thick and sweet. Embalmer's syrup mixed with soot. And the last of the town's children turned toward their mothers and whispered, "Do ya? I'll remember when you lied at the funeral." The adults fell to their knees. Because every lie, every buried truth, every hidden stillbirth, every abandoned secret under the family plot had risen to be counted, and the tally wasn't complete yet. They say the last thing heard from Black Hollow was not a scream. It was a lullaby, carried on a wind that shouldn't have been warm. The chapel was never found again, at least not in daylight. What remained was a depression in the earth, perfectly round, 20 feet wide, lined in cinders. At the center, the same iron key that once belonged to Father Kettner, still warm. And beneath it, if you dig carefully enough, the earth tastes different. Sweet, metallic, hollow. In 1902, a mining surveyor stumbled onto the site while charting coal lines. He never turned in his report. Instead, he carved a note into the side of his wagon before he disappeared. "I followed the velvet tunnel. I heard 17 voices, but they spoke in one name. Gravediggers don't bury bodies. They plant them." Since then, 23 attempts have been made to build over Black Hollow. Churches, schools, homes. Every one of them ends the same. Vacant within a year. Doors lock themselves. Clocks run backward. Children vanish for hours and return humming melodies that have no origin in any hymnal. In 1971, a historian researching funeral rites in Pennsylvania rediscovered the name Caleb Dressler in an old will dispute. She traced the line down through land deeds and burial records. Every 70 years, a Dressler child is born, under a black moon. Every 70 years, 17 disappearances occur within a 30-mile radius. The pattern never breaks. The professions change. Not always gravediggers. Sometimes undertakers. Sometimes morticians. Sometimes pastors. But always someone who tends the dead. And always a child who sings in silence until they find the trapdoor. The Dressler line still exists. Hidden, protected, revered by those who know, and feared by those who remember what was planted under Black Hollow. Because the earth there never really closed. It just waits, listens, and counts. Not forward, not backward, but sideways, where the lost are folded and restitched into form, where 17 never meant 17. It meant one, made from many, buried in plain sight. So if the soil under your home ever begins to hum, if your children start singing lullabies you don't remember teaching them, don't dig, don't pray, don't ask, because what you uncover was never supposed to die.